Thank you. Hello everyone, so I'm Andrew Reeve. I'm a New Zealander, not an Australian like some of you guys have thought so far. It's super exciting to be here. As a beer lover, I haven't been to the US for 20 years, and the US is home to some of the best craft brewers in the world. So before coming to this, I tacked a week on and did LA, San Diego, then flew up to here, and then I'm going to New York on the way out. So it's been a super exciting trip and I'm loving the US. So a bit about me. I used to live in New Zealand. I was in a very corporate job. I used to be a production engineer in a power station. And I kind of was like, I want to do something really, really interesting. I want to start something for myself. So New Zealand is 4.5 million people. London is 4.5 million people just inside Zone 2. So I've got a UK passport, so I quit my job at 23, booked a one-way flight to the UK with no real plan of what I wanted to do. I just wanted to start something. So in New Zealand, I was always a home brewer. So I was always brewing beer. My parents let me brew beer when I was 16. They said, hey, if it's good enough to drink, we'll let you drink it. But it was awful. It was some of the worst beer I've ever had. But when I arrived in London, I moved into this tiny, really small, cramped apartment. And my flatmates were like, what are you doing? This is such a mess. Like, can you stop doing this? So I was like, there must be other people in London who've got the same problem. So I built a little brew kit, kicked it up to an iPhone app and started running like these open brewing sessions. So 20 or 30 people would come along and a different craft brewer would come along and lead it. And we're just teaching people how to make beer. And that was kind of like the initial idea of what Honest Brew was. But doing these sessions, people would come up to me and be like, I love craft beer, but I don't find it that accessible. So when I find a brewery I really love, they might be selling to a very local area. And at the same time, I might find an IPA they make, which is great, but I don't know what other beers that are going to be similar to it. So if I drink an IPA and then I try someone else's, it'll be completely different and not what I want. So that was like, this is a real aha moment. This is something that we can literally solve online. We can build a personalized service for people that can deliver beer to their door and that kind of brings all those elements together. So that was kind of the idea behind the initial Honest Brew start. So we're now, fast forward on, so this started in 2014 was when Honest Brew went live. We're now the UK's leading online craft beer retailer. We've had over 2,500 different beers from all around the world. We work with over 200 different breweries. About 30 of them are US breweries. And we're both a transactional and a subscription model. So when we started, kind of around here, we were doing something like 50 orders a month. And I remember like that first sale coming through and you just say, yes, we sold something. And fast forward that to Christmas this year, we're at 500 orders a day. Christmas this year, we think we're going to do 1,500 a day. And so that's kind of the growth rate that we've done over the last 3 years. Now, our MVP kind of stack as we started, it was WooCommerce. We had Stripe in the back end. We weren't even using subscriptions plugins. We were having a little calendar that one of the guys would manually put when people's payments would be. Would manually process them in Stripe. And then we ran emails through MailChimp and found a company that could ship some beer. So this was like very lean, very rough and ready. And we chose WooCommerce because we wanted something that we could easily set up and get selling. And I kind of thought, hey, we'll do this for the first year and we'll probably end up re-platforming eventually. At the same time we were building, WooCommerce 2.1 came out. And that was like super exciting for me from like a tech perspective. That was when the REST API got merged into Core. And that was when it kind of said to us, well, like WooCommerce will actually work. We can potentially scale this thing and focus on potentially having it as a back end. So this was like a really exciting thing for me. The rest of the team probably were just like, this is super boring. So this was like our first oh shit moment for me was like, we can actually scale this thing technically. The next oh shit moment was we need to actually scale this thing. So in 2014, we raised our first round of investment. So we raised £250,000 from some seed investors who kind of believed in the guys and girls who were selling 50 boxes a month. And at that stage, we were all about subscriptions. So 90% of our revenue was from a subscription model where people would come in and tell us what kind of flavors and tastes they like in beer, and then we'd send them a personalized box. So if you don't like dark beers, you don't get dark beers from us. So about 90% of what we were doing in terms of revenue was all of those kind of personalized subscriptions. And at the time when we raised money, like subscriptions were a massive fad in a way. Like everybody was doing a subscription box company. Investors loved them. They loved all these acronyms: monthly recurring revenue, lifetime value, reliable forecasting for stock. You could see why investors were wanting to put money into this business. But to actually scale a subscription, the biggest thing is actually being sticky. So when you deep dive into the analysis side of how a subscription works, you need to find that sticky point where people are like, I love what you guys do. And that's the point usually where 80% of your customers have churned out and you've kept the remaining 20%. And these are the people who really love your product. So for us, this is the third box. So by the time someone actually gets their third box, they become very sticky. They're like, I love what you guys do. You understand my taste. You're nailing this as a service. So all we were focusing on around this time was how do we get more people to their sticky moment? So we had a few ideas of what was causing people to be sticky. So one of them was people want to learn more about the beers they're drinking. So they want to hear the story about these brewers. They want to see the flavors behind the beers and the tastes. So that was our first hypothesis. The second one was that people drink beer in their underpants. So we're a home delivery service, and we had another idea that when people are drinking beer at home, it's usually in a lot more of a casual environment than at the pub. And when people are doing this, they're doing this on a mobile device, not in front of a laptop. So it was another idea that we had started to prove was that, hey, mobile is actually really, really big for us. And me being super excited, I was like, we need to build an app. We need an app that can solve this for customers, that can get more people to be sticky. So we were like, okay, we want something that can tell people about the beers and be in the place that they're actually drinking them, so that we get that experience and get more people to see the value of what we're actually providing to them. So we did an MVP of the app. So iOS to start with. We built it in React Native. The whole idea behind that was that we could easily port it, well, easily-ish port it over to Android. And then we used the WooCommerce API in the back end. I mean, has anyone here had a go yet at doing React Native? How have you guys found it? All right-ish? All right? Yeah, that's the thing we really love is that you can write in JavaScript. So for me running the business and running the team, we can keep a team that's skilled in JavaScript rather than having to learn Swift or whatever language that we're actually coding in. So that was a huge benefit from a business perspective is, hey, we can do this with our current team and our current knowledge, albeit quite a steep learning curve. So, hey, that seems to have jumped. There we go. So our initial app prototype, this is over 2 pages, so I'll kind of run through it. Initial loading page and then a login page that we built. The login page, basically if you got an error, so your login was incorrect, password error, we actually just offload you back to the website for a password reset. So we didn't build all of those things into the app. We were just like, okay, this is an MVP. So kind of go into those. You can see those at the top. So if someone wanted to head back to the home page, we'd just load a view for that. And then forgot password, we'd just take them back to the My Account Lost Password. So the main things we wanted to do here was to show people the orders, so the boxes they've had in the past, to be able to go in and actually view an order, so they can see, okay, what flavors and notes did I have set, and what beers are these guys sending me, or what beers have they sent me in the past, and then actually go in and view a product and find out more about that product. So learn about the brewer, learn about the flavors and the tastes and the notes behind it. So these are our UIs. So initial login page, very simple. So we used OAuth 2 as a plugin to do all the logging in side of it. And then we just did a simple UI to show the orders page. So you just get a list here of all your orders coming in. And then finally over this side, once you click inside an order, you get the name of the service that you've got, the flavors that you selected. So these are the attributes we use to filter beers for people. So light, crisp, citrusy, fruity. The option of the box size you got, so 12 beers, and then the frequency. So this was all pulled down from the API endpoints. We had to put a few custom ones in here because we were working with WooCommerce subscriptions. And then a list of all the beers that you can scroll down through. And then finally, this was the real value we wanted to start giving people, was showing people about the beer, the story behind it from the brewer, the flavor notes, so why we picked this beer for them, and then a bit more story about the brewery there. So this was like our MVP. Our big kind of thinking around this was we wanted to add in some rights stuff eventually so people could manage their subscription. choose the next date for dispatch, pieces like that we wanted to develop on. But this was kind of our other oh shit moment. So in 2016, we were probably 70% subscription, 30% transactional. And we kind of had a view then that transactional was going to be the way forward for Honest Brew as a business. Craft beer, when we started, was about 1.5% of the UK beer market in 2014. 2016, it was 8% of the beer market. In the US here, it's about 15% on volume, 20% on value. So in 2 to 3 years, there was this huge growth of consumers inside craft beer. At the same time, they're actually becoming more and more educated in what they wanted. They started to understand specific breweries that they wanted. They started to understand specific beers they were looking to see. And at the same time, there was a huge kind of uplift around Christmas and gifting periods like Father's Day, which we just weren't really covering with our subscription. So we did a massive pivot to focus on transactional, which when you have a look at our MVP of the app, basically killed that as a proposition. Why are we building in a back-end app to keep people sticky for a business model that we're starting to move away from? So one of the things we looked at, this is actually 2017 data, because I think it's fascinating, was around the growth of mobile. So in 2014, when we first started, 33% of our traffic was mobile, 10% of our revenue came from mobile devices, with an extremely low conversion rate. You fast forward that to now, and 60% of our traffic is mobile. But what's really fascinating to us is now a third of our revenue is coming from mobile devices, and our conversion rate, while still not super high, has massively climbed over that period. And that's kind of like where my view's gone now. As to 2017 Honest Brew, native is actually starting to take a back seat in what we want to do, and we want to start focusing on our web app experience. And that was like huge to this happening, was if we do native, we have to maintain a whole nother stack. Whereas if we can actually start to go into the web app side, we can start to use things like progressive web app. And this is where the REST API actually starts to unlock things for when you're doing PWA. So if anyone hasn't had a look at PWA, I think it's really, really interesting from a technology perspective. But it starts to show where web apps can go. Things like service workers to give you offline access. So your phone can basically function, or your web app can basically function like a native app. If Google detects it is a PWA app, it'll actually start to promote a home screen install. So you can basically build a native app in JavaScript on a front end and not have to ever deal with the Apple Store. So I think this is a really exciting part of where we see the future of mobile going for us, and the REST API supporting that. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit more about the REST API, because even though I'm talking about React and React Native, I think what the API has done is made WooCommerce scale for us, because it's opened up a whole realm of what we can actually do. So I wanted to talk about another part of our business and how we leverage the REST API to do that. So this here is a beer picker. So this is our basic recommendation engine that we have in the back end. So when an order comes through for a customer, we put it into a picking status instead of putting it into processing. And then you can come in here and pop this up. This loads in, I think I can use this. This here loads in the flavors for that user. So this person's selected all flavors. And then it creates a filter here on the left-hand side. So these are all beers that they've never had before on the left. And then this is a selection of 12 beers that it recommends to put in that box. So the guys can literally just hit add, loads this into their order, and we ship that off to our warehouse for fulfillment. So this is 18 months old now. The big problem we have with this is, does anyone here ever built recommendation engines or doing anything with recommendations? One person. So recommendations are fascinating, and I think it's a big part of where our scales come from. So recommendations like this is like a content-based recommendation. So we know that someone likes light and crisp beer. We filter this list with beers that are light and crisp. So we have to put an attribute on every single beer, and that's how the filtering works. This is a kind of recommendation system you can do in WooCommerce, because it's less heavy on SQL queries, and it's something that kind of scales. But we want to move to a new type of recommendations. So there's another type called collaborative. And what that does is, instead of us saying, okay, you want light and crisp beers, you say, I like these beers. And then we say, what other customers have liked those beers, and what other beers do they like? So then we start recommending beers to you outside of like a parameter, and actually based on proper feedback from customers. So that's where we want to move to, but that you can't do as an extension or a plugin. So that's where this comes in. So this is our next project that we're currently working on. This is leveraging the REST API. So Woo as the back end. We're using an open source machine learning server. I highly recommend people to check it out if you're interested in machine learning. And that basically takes inputs from the API. We're doing a bit of sanitizing of data in between that. And then we're actually going to put a Vue front end on top. So we're actually moving away from React as well to start working with Vue. So this is currently in development. And the huge power that this gets is our current recommendation engine is just a back-end tool that the guys can use for orders, whereas we can now start to put this on the front end. So when people actually come into our site, they can tell us what they like and bear, and they can instantly get feedback from that on the front end. So that's super exciting in terms of what we're doing for product. And that gets me really excited about WooCommerce as like an ecosystem and as a product, because you can start to do some really cool stuff like this. So I kind of see enterprise WooCommerce as a system built around microservices now. So when you want to do technology like recommendation engines, you don't do that in a SQL database. You use things like Elasticsearch. You use like things like Node.js. And having a REST API allows you to go to a microservices architecture where you can isolate that out into a box, you can look after it, and it doesn't impact the main site. So I showed this before, like our basic stack. This is what we start to use now in terms of services. So a lot of these are all SaaS. There's other back-end things here like SendGrid, like what Zach was talking about, like offloading stuff from the server. We've just put Algolia on the front end as well, and that's offload a huge amount of search from the server. Basically, you want PHP and WooCommerce just to be doing the back-end stuff. So things like Ops, Stripe, TradeGecko does all of our inventory management. We don't use WooCommerce reporting anymore. We've offloaded that to Metoric. Mixpanel for all of our analytics. Zendesk talks to Metoric, which talks to Woo. Dotmailer for all of our marketing. Smartly for like Facebook ads and bits and pieces. So we're starting to offload like a lot of our stack into services. But that also starts to come into our development now. So this recommendation engine used to be a plugin, and now we're moving it out to a microservice. And I think it's an interesting one for like people who are plugin builders or extension builders. Like, do you build an extension as a plugin now, or do you actually consider building that as a microservice and selling that as a SaaS? Because when you're building it as a SaaS, you get to control that product. You can spec the back end and use the technology you want to use that's best for your product. So I think it's like an interesting thing to think about, and you can see a few companies are doing it now, like Jilt has made their product a SaaS. Things like Metoric is a SaaS, because then they can control the full stack. So that leads me to my last point. So the hardest part of scaling WooCommerce is actually tech talent. So it's super hard for us to find really, really good WooCommerce developers, especially at an enterprise level. And this is the hardest part for scaling Woo. And this is one of the other reasons I like microservices, because it allows us to hire Vue, Node.js developers who can build functionality for our stack, but don't have to be a PHP developer. I think this is going to unlock our growth essentially. The last point is like why I think this is important for WooCommerce as well is because when entrepreneurs and store owners look at a platform, one of the questions they ask themselves is how big can this get? Most businesses fail in like 2 years and they never get there. But when they're selecting the platform, they want to know that their think big idea can actually scale with that platform. So I think like this is probably the big power that WooCommerce has got as a product now against everything else in the market is that WooCommerce allows store owners to think big. You can actually be really creative with this as a product. I think that's huge. I think the more we can showcase what you can do with WooCommerce, the more powerful that whole ecosystem will get. That's it from me. Any questions on bits? I know I've kind of diverged a bit from just React Native now, but I thought it was kind of interesting to show some of those bits that we're doing. Yeah, so the question was there, how do we incentivize users to download? So that was the other part of why we like web app experiences. Because I don't know if any of you guys have seen, but the average install rates now for apps are something like 1 install a month for like the average user, and most of those are games. So it's super hard to get someone to install an app, and there's a lot of friction in doing that, which is why our web app experience has got far more power because Google tells you to use that. And basically what PWA does is allows you to have that native experience without asking for a download. Yeah?
How did you negotiate the balance between
So that question there was, why didn't you tell people about these beers in a physical way inside the box versus an app? The biggest issue was having the range of beers we have. So we've got 2,500 products, so we need 2,500 individual cards. And we tested that, but we just couldn't scale it. So for every beer we'd pick, we'd have to pick a card as well. And one of the things I don't talk about here is scaling operations is super hard. So going from 50 orders a month to 1,500 a day is super hard to do. And you almost need to operate that very lean, so we couldn't put physical stuff in and make that scale. There, and then up there. So we use TradeGecko. We've been with them for 18 months, 2 years. So they plug into the REST API, fetch down all the orders, it goes into their system, and then we have another API that offloads that to our warehouse. So once we pack it inside of there, we'll offload it. And we've got a couple of processes in there that run that say, okay, if this order's got no back-ordered stock and it's ready to ship, we'll just automatically pack it and pass it off to our warehouse. So it's a really nice tool, actually, TradeGecko. We've gone through a few scaling issues with them as we kind of dumped down like 1,000 orders a day. But yeah, it's a really good product. There was a question at the back.
So when you're talking about using microservices, using it to like section off certain parts of the API that you want to expose through like running portions, or referring to the API?
I'm referring, so the question there was, when I'm talking about microservices, am I talking about a portion of the API, or am I talking about the product or the area itself? I mean, if we talk about the recommendation engine as a good example, that's a microservice pulling that recommendation engine out of WooCommerce and running that on a node stack. So that is running in its own little microservice. So all that piece of build does is just recommend beers. That's all it's built for. And we can scale that up and down based on how many API requests it's got. There's an intermediate inside there which interacts with the WooCommerce API and allows us to kind of sanitize some of that data to make it work better. But the microservices idea is that you can pull out parts of your code base and run them in a stack and technology that makes most sense for those. And also means that you can scale them really easily, because you don't need all this processing power on your back end if you're better suited doing some of it in a different piece of technology like a recommendation engine. I mean, I'd hate to think what kind of server would need to do collaborative filtering in MySQL. Anyone else? It is getting close to lunchtime. Cool. Oh, if there's no more questions, that's probably everything from me. I'll be around the rest of the day and tonight. I'll probably be going to a brewery for a beer. My recommendation for Seattle, for people who are new in, is a brewery called Cloudburst. It's just up on the top of the hill. It's about 3 or 4 minute walk. Some of the best beers I've had in Seattle have come from them, but it's super small, so don't all kind of rush there. Thank you, everyone.